Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dan Brumberg, and I want to wish everybody hello, and on behalf of the United States Institute of Peace, I'm delighted we've got such a turnout. It's a tribute to the importance of this subject and to the fact that it's not pouring rain. And after a week of rain, we're so delighted that some cooperation from the weather. And so welcome here, and I have to say that we have to plead to some extent fatigue, because we have spent 3 hours with our colleagues in the United States government talking about some of the results of this ongoing study, which we hope to finish in the coming weeks. And I think it was a good rehearsal, but we're all a little exhausted from our intense discussions for the last few hours. But we will do our best to wake ourselves up and give you a sense of some of the results of this project in the context, in particular, of the recent elections in Iran. And by way of framing today's discussion, I just want to say a few things about this project. We created some more than 2.5 years now ago an internal working group looking at the dynamics of political, social, and economic change in Iran. The project that we have been working on through a group of 9 scholars, 2 of whom are sitting here at the table, and 1 of whom is coming from Geneva via Skype, and I'll introduce them in a moment. The purpose of this project was to look at dynamics of political and social and economic change that were certainly not examined by within the mainstream media, but even more so often were not taken seriously or in any systematic way by many scholars. And at the time, of course, we were swimming a little bit upstream, because what prompted the interest of this study group was the events in June 2009, when, in the wake of a contested election, the state revved up its repressive apparatus even more than had been previously revved up, and looked as if it was systematically going about shutting down much of the political apparatus which had defined what the Islamic Republic was in all of its dissonance and complexity. In the context of that dynamic, to some extent, the main consensus among many watchers of Iranian politics, certainly within the Beltway and beyond, was that Iran was becoming a securitized state, that whatever the Islamic Republic had been prior to June 2009, it had been stripped of most of its republican aspects, its democratic aspects, as contained and as constrained as they were. And as a consequence, Iran was becoming some version of a revolutionary / Rahbar leader state, in which politics was really not what it used to be, and there was very little, if any, room for contestation. A lot of scholars noted the systematic effort to rid the Islamic Republic of 2 of the key wings that had helped make the Islamic Revolution possible in the first place, and which had played important, if not leading, roles in Iran during the 80s and 90s. So there was an emerging consensus that the fundamental nature of Iranian politics had been changing. As a consequence of that, there were various conclusions drawn about those implications, not only for Iran and the region, but for Iran's foreign policy and the nuclear issue as well. So what we wanted to do was, in some sense, interrogate that thesis and suggest an opposing hypothesis, because really, if it was treated as a thesis, it was really only a hypothesis. And we wanted to set out another possible hypothesis, and that was that there were arenas of real politics, often not given, as I said before, sufficient attention, both within the academic community and the policy and media communities. And we wanted to interrogate and look and dig down deep and look at dynamics in the judiciary, in the universities, in the parliament, electoral system, in the Green movement itself, in the Reformist movement, and see if we can detect possible political struggles which might have a longer-term impact, particularly in terms of the prospects for some reopening of the political sphere that might take place through a process of limited but potentially significant political accommodation between ruling political elites on the one hand and estranged or alienated political elites on the other. And so that was the other hypothesis, which was very much in the mainstream of considering the dynamics of transitions, which, of course, as many of you know, often begin with the smallest opening, the most imperceptible political accommodations, but which over time can have longer-term implications. So we weren't looking for the D word, necessarily democratization, in any dramatic sense. We were looking for hints of political contestation, of accommodation, of struggle, and that might over time create the basis for a reopening of the political sphere, and perhaps not in the way, and perhaps suggest dynamics of political change that were very much going against what was a kind of the Washington emerging consensus about the so-called security state in Iran, a security state that in many respects, of course, does exist. And we wouldn't want for a moment to deny that in terms of both the rising power of the Revolutionary Guards, the Basij on the one side, as well as the supreme leader, that this is a political system that was in any sense open. No, those those forces had made major significant gains. June 2009 was evidence of that, but still there were dynamics that we thought were important. And in many respects, while it might be an exaggeration to say we feel vindicated by the recent elections, presidential elections in Iran, we certainly do feel that not only the election itself, Rouhani's election, but more importantly, the ensuing dynamics that have been unfolding every day in Iran since then, including the negotiations within the regime and between the regime and various estranged political elites, that there is something going on and that Iran has real politics that are worth thinking about and looking at, again, with a long-term perspective of trying to ask ourselves what all this means. So that's what this project is all about. Most of the participants in the project, not all, but a number of them, are going back to somewhat tweak some of their contributions. We will be writing up a overview report that we will put out through USIP about the project, and then the project will also have a second iteration as an edited volume, which I'm working on with my colleague Farida Farhi, who decided that she prefers living in Hawaii than Washington, D.C. I can't understand why. And she joined us at 4:30 in the morning, her time, this morning to meet with our colleagues in government, so she's hopefully fast asleep. So I'm going to speak on behalf of Farida as well, who's been instrumental in this whole project. So that's really what it's all about. And of course, this meeting, as well as our meeting this morning, was an effort to sort of project and discuss the results, the emerging results of these various studies, their implications for domestic politics, regional and international politics, in the context of the recent elections, and what the election of Rouhani might tell us, not only about the dynamics of presidential elections, but also upcoming, they're not around the corner, but they will happen, more parliamentary elections, and overall, in a much more macro sense, the evolution of the Iranian political system. So with that in mind, we are going to hear from three colleagues today. We're going to start with our colleague Farzan, who is coming all the way from Farzan Sabeh from Switzerland, from Geneva. Farzan, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. I want to add one more word about the work that Farzan and his colleague has been doing for this project. We started talking about dynamics of political and social change in an array of arenas affected by the rise of the Revolutionary Guards and the continuing empowerment of the supreme leader. The original project that we undertook did not include papers on the security sector itself, and we realized that in the final analysis, to make the project complete, we needed those papers, and we needed that contribution. So we commissioned 3 more pieces of research, one of which Farzan has produced in its first iteration, and he'll be revising it for the project in the coming weeks. And so we asked him to come via Skype to talk for about 10 minutes about that paper, concentrating on the dynamics of the Revolutionary Guards in the context of, or against the background of what's happened in Iran, and he'll be talking about that. And then we'll shift the discussion to Kevan Harris. Kevan was in Iran recently. He witnessed the elections. His work is probably familiar to many of you, and he's going to talk about the election itself with some illustrative slides as well, and try to ferret out what that election means in terms of the evolution of Iran's electoral system in general. And then finally, our friend and colleague Fatima Hajagitu, your name always presents a challenge for me. But Fatima is a scholar in Boston and was for many years a critical member of of course, the modulus, the sixth modulus in Iran and the reformist movement. And she has written a very important paper on the debates within the Green movement and the reformist movement that were precipitated before and around the June 2009 elections. And Fatima will be talking about drawing from her paper, but more focusing very much on what the recent elections would suggest for the evolution of a reformist movement and their various strategies to promote some measure of political opening and accommodation and negotiation within Iran itself. So those are the big agenda items we have for today. And I'm now going to turn over the mic to Farzan. And Farzan, I'm going to, I guess, be working. This is extremely complicated, particularly for someone as technologically inept as I am. I'm going to be working your slide presentation from here,
okay.
And you're going to say the word slide loudly and clearly every time I'm supposed to. And I think I'm going to go to, is that correct? Do I have it, the first slide there, Farzan?
Yep.
Okay.
You can just put it up on just the very first slide, and then we'll go to the questions after my introduction.
Okay, there you go. Okay. So are we starting there, right? Great. Speak up very loudly. The mic connection we have is far from perfect. And speak loudly and slowly. You've got about 10 or 12 minutes, and that's, and I am the supreme leader here today, and I will be exercising my absolute authority as best I can. Of course, we know that the supreme leader is never as supreme as he claims to be, so sometimes it doesn't work out. So anyway, Farzan, you have the floor. Thank you, or the mic.
Thank you. So first of all, I'd like to thank Professor Daniel Brumberg for inviting me to participate in this project, and Mar Al-Nouri for all of her support during the entire process of writing. The presentation today is based partially on the larger manuscript my co-author, Ruzda Safshigan, and I have been working on for the United States Institute of Peace on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a political actor in Iran. So my presentation today tries to focus a bit more broadly on the principlist political current, Iran's conservative, and to take into account the 2013 Iranian presidential election. So because I've had to condense so much material into a 12-minute presentation, certain aspects might be addressed in a kind of a perfunctory manner, so I have to go through them in some greater depth during the question and answer period. So if we can go to slide 1, the questions. The major questions I try to address are, what political struggles are there within the principlist political current? What can these struggles tell us about the place and role of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iranian politics? And what are the implications of inter-principlist political struggles in the context of the 2013 presidential election, particularly in terms of constraining the power of the IRGC? Next slide, please. So who are the principalists? Principalists, or usulgayan, are a conservative and heterogeneous political current who have dominated the Islamic Republic from at least 2005 to 2013. The heterogeneous principalist elements share at least 3 main characteristics, although there are many more. So they're more politically authoritarian than the reformist or centrist political currents. They're socioculturally conservative, and they believe in a much more hardline foreign policy, although even within the principalists, as we'll show, there is some variation. So there's extent to which they're maybe more hardline or less hardline. So these elements united as a kind of a reaction to the rise of the reform movement in the late 1990s, especially after the election, the landslide election of Mohammad Khatami in 1997. Next slide, please. So the principles are composed of various elements, and I've tried to just give 3 examples here, although these are by no means the only ones. So the mercantile class, or the famous bazaris that many of you have probably heard of, the Iranian Shia clerical establishment. This is not to say that there aren't many very high-ranking grand ayatollahs who have reformist or centrist tendencies, but the broader establishment in the city of Qom does have a strong tendency to lean towards the principalists and the IRGC. So just some examples of principalist politicians include President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, Speaker of the Parliament Ali Larijani, and Chief Negotiator Saeed Jalili. Next slide, please. So the principals dominate the unelected Islamic centers of power, as well as some of the elected Republican centers of power. So one example of an unelected institution or a center of power is the Council of Guardians and the IRGC. They also currently are the most powerful grouping within the parliament, although they are divided between different groups. So their rise to power initially began in 2003, first by when they took the city and village councils. then in the parliament in 2004, and finally the president in 2005. And they did this by leveraging their influence over unelected centers of power, for example, to mass disqualify reformist candidates. And there was also some degree of voter apathy in the elections, which allowed the principalists to come to power. Next slide, please. So there aren't any well agreed upon definitions of various political groups inside Iran. Since 2009, my co-writer and I, Riza Safshkan, have been using kind of defining the principles being divided into two very broad groups. One of the traditional principles. So these are the power elite who basically helped lead the revolution and emerged in it as senior politicians, and they held a very senior position throughout the early first decade of the revolution between 1979 and 1989. And they're very much rooted in traditional economic networks, such as the bazaar, and they tend to be the somewhat less hardline principalists. Then we have the neo-principalists. So this power elite emerged from the Iran-Iraq War, and very specifically the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So although not all of the individuals we would label as neo-principals are necessarily from the IRGC, the overall majority are, and vice versa. Not all former IRGC members are necessarily the hardline neo-principalists. A great example would be Mohsen Rezai, who, since leaving the Guards, has taken a much more moderate position within the principalists. And the new principles are also much more rooted in the post-war kind of modern, with quotes, economic networks. The Fossil MBA headquarters, the economic arm of the Guards, is a great example of this. And they tend to be much more hardline, and I can kind of go a bit more into this in the question and answer period if anyone's interested. So having understood kind of the basics about who the principalists are and how we can conceive of the IRGC as a political actor within the context of the principalist political current, how can we kind of understand the IRGC as a political actor? Well, as I mentioned above, they're kind of the main backers of the neo-principalists. And what we would like to submit is that their influence on Iranian politics, while at certain points very direct, hasn't been a military coup style approach. It's a much more subtle and much more gradual. Next slide, please. So the IRGC isn't simply a security institution. It's a vast social, political, economic, and security complex. And we've tried to outline some of their main sources of power. They've since Khamenei ascended to the supreme leadership, they've had his backing, and they've had the support of various unelected centers of power that are under the control of Khamenei. They're also the single most important security actor with Iran. So they virtually paralleled the entire normal Republican Iranian security institutions. They have their own military, intelligence, and policing bodies. They're a very powerful economic actor, although by no means as large as they're often made out to be in the media. And it's really difficult to say for certain because a lot of the major contracts they have and a lot of the work they do, it isn't available publicly. So, but from the public sources we do know that they're a very powerful economic actor. And finally, they have a limited but well-organized social base. The kind of most important example of which is the Basij network, which is the grassroots of the IRGC. Next slide, please. So the first instance of their intervention politics we found during our study of the IRGC as a political actor was in 1996, and they've attempted to influence politics through various mechanisms. So the first is through more formal mechanisms. The IRGC, according to their charter, and which was approved by the parliament, and according to the constitution, do have a responsibility to guard the revolution and its achievement. And they've taken liberty with this sometimes to interpret it rather broadly. So, for example, they've used their role as a security actor to establish red lines. A good example of this is the letter a number of IRGC commanders sent to Khatami in 1999, which is believed to have established certain red lines regarding his reforms and to have had a somewhat of a chilling effect on the reform movement, although it kept going strong after this point. They also have many important informal mechanisms that they use to influence politics. The kind of main one is they mobilize their social base to vote in elections and stage political demonstrations. So a very major example is the 2005 presidential election, when they mobilized their grassroots behind Ahmadinejad and said to have been one of the decisive factors in his victory. Finally, they're not by no means absolute power over the state bureaucracy, but they do have a good amount of influence. And so they are believed to have, in some instances, potentially used it to commit electoral fraud. And the 2009 presidential election is one case of that. While we don't have very hard evidence that we can say with absolute certainty that there was fraud, there is strong indication that within the Interior Ministry and elsewhere, they used their influence alongside other principles. It wasn't the only Revolutionary Guards. It was the principles of political current more broadly to commit electoral fraud. Next slide, please. So since 1996, the rise of the IRGC has generally been an upward trend. So 1996 is their first recorded attempt to influence politics. As I said, it was in a midterm parliamentary election in Tehran. Mohsen Rezai basically giving a speech to the Mohammad Rasulullah division, basically saying this is our first political operation, so you're due to go out with your families and vote for our favorite candidates to help ensure that they win. During the late 90s, they also used their formal mechanisms as a security actor to undermine Khatami and the reform movement with some success. Finally, between 2003 and 2005, they actually empowered certain political proxies who, again, we've labeled as neo-principalists, to enter various elected bodies, specifically city and village councils, parliament, and the presidency. And the presidency was kind of the ultimate point of this. So between 2005 and 2013, the neo-principalists took most of the important economic and security portfolios in the cabinet, and through this and other mechanisms, had a very strong influence over politics in Iran. And so they used this political power to also reinforce their role, their security role, expand their economic power, and to try to influence the state bureaucracy. So one example would be an agreement between the oil ministry under Rustam Qasemi and the Basij to basically bring in Basij to train with the oil ministry, kind of an attempt to place their managers within the organization, although we'll show this has met with some limited success. Next slide, please. Now, while it's generally been an upward trend, their rise as a political actor, beginning in 2010, although some may claim earlier, they've also faced major obstacles in terms of their conquest of power and attempts to centralize the state under themselves. So the first big one that everyone by now is probably well aware of is the schism within neo-principalists. Basically, President Ahmadinejad, following the 2009 election, felt confident enough to show his true political colors and try to pursue an agenda independent of the neo-principles. And what our study tries to show is that the schism is very real and it seriously compromised their political project. In the 2012 Iranian parliamentary elections, neo-principles tried to dominate the parliament, but they weren't able to. And so they had to continue relying on an increasingly weakening coalition with traditional principalists to pursue their agenda. And so, for example, they had a preference for Haddad Adel to become the Speaker of the Parliament, but ultimately the more moderate traditional principalist Ali Larijani took that post. Finally, in the 2013 election, a lot of people have been trying to explain kind of what happened, and it might still be too soon. We might not still have enough evidence, but one of the kind of clearest things that we've seen is that the traditional principles and neo-principles, there was a clear break between them, and so they basically didn't present a very strong united front in the election, and it also would have made it more difficult for them to commit any kind of electoral fraud if the traditional principles weren't on board with them. So, next slide, please. So, just to kind of go into the conclusion, the IRGC as a body remains the most powerful political actor in Iran, and I think this is what our study shows based on the empirics. But they've had a lot of difficulty trying to, by themselves, turn this power they have in the security sector and within the economy into political power. And so they've had to continue relying on these coalitions with various political proxies, and often these coalitions don't prove very lasting and ultimately reliable in the long term. And without these coalitions, the IRGC have basically been unable to attract sufficient broad popular support, and they've been unable to dominate the state bureaucracy. What does this mean? They haven't been able to place their people to the extent they probably would have liked to the economy. One is that they don't have the level of experience and the kind of people compared to various other political currents, but the other has been that the traditional principles and others haven't really gone along with this project to the extent they would have liked. And so because they've poorly managed these limitations, they suffered what we believe to be a devastating defeat in the 2013 presidential election. So there has been some discussion that, the Rouhani is the establishment man. it's the IRGC's win. But we don't think this is the case, and we think the 2013 election was a blow to the IRGC. Next slide, please. So the rise of the IRGC as a political actor is a real important phenomenon. However, it's in no way inevitable, and it's not irreversible. In 2013, the Iranian political elite, and specifically the traditional principles, and more broadly the Iranian people, basically constrained the IRGC. There was a perception that the IRGC was leading Iran down the road of basically to war and to a much higher level of sanctions. And so they were both the rest of the political elite and the people acted to some extent to constrain the IRGC within politics. And for now, they remain dazed and confused over the election outcome, and they're not really sure how to go forward. There are indications that they intend to confront Rouhani, but for now, they're lying back and just letting events unfold. So, final slide, please. So, how do we think this may play out? I guess their potential confrontation with Rouhani. What will empower the IRGC versus weaken it? And well, the main political issue in Iran today is the foreign policy problem of the nuclear crisis. And a win on this issue, it can be more broadly conceived for any political current who gets it as a win in Iranian politics. But winning on this specific issue isn't the same for kind of moderates, so centrist, reformist, and to a lesser extent traditional principles versus the hardline. For moderates such as Rouhani, basically a win would be a negotiated settlement of the nuclear crisis and the lifting of sanctions. But the IRGC actually has an interest as having its main power, the security actor, in the nuclear crisis continuing, which actually empowers them, and for sanctions to remain in place. We can go into this discussion a bit more in the questions perhaps, but the sanctions that while they've weakened Iran economically overall, they've actually in a lot of ways helped enhance the economic power of the IRGC within Iran. And so what factors could help facilitate an IRGC win? Well, the main one is if the IRGC uses the influence it has in deciding policy within the Middle East to basically pursue an adventurous policy, so raising tensions even more in Syria and the Persian Gulf and elsewhere. But I think the state of the kind of moderate Rouhani political project to some extent is also in the hands of the Obama administration in terms of how much of a hardline negotiating position they take towards Rouhani. So it's kind of like a tango. Both sides have to take a step for the dance to work. And if there's kind of a position that Rouhani has to concede and take the first step, then that would weaken Rouhani, I believe, and the moderates more broadly, and strengthen the IRGC in the long term. So that's it. That's my presentation, and thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you very much for presenting the slides and coming to us. And you're sticking with us, right?
Yes, sir, I am.
As we move along. You know, that last remark you made, Obama administration hardline negotiating position towards Rouhani. This has been however you define hard line, this has been a discussion that we had extensively today and beyond today in our reports, because our group is by no means, there's no consensus in our group on any of the issues we've been talking about. It's politically a very diverse group, includes people who are associated with the reformist movement, the Greens, scholars coming from different perspectives. We did not attempt to in any way impose a preconceived consensus, even if out of this diversity of views, which is interesting, emerges a certain element of consensus. And one element of consensus which is very clear, and I want to emphasize that this was reached very much prior to the election in Iran, is that historically speaking, and Kavan, your paper talks about this at length, but it's not the only one, that the empowering of the security sector is in no small way attached to the situation of conflict that exists between Iran, its neighbors, and the global community. And it's in the context of these conflicts that the security sector thrives and depends on conflict. Of course, that may give them an incentive to sabotage any effort at overcoming this Cold War of U.S.-Iranian relations. But in any case, the expanding economic and political and ideological influence or reach, or certainly aspirations of the Revolutionary Guards, is directly related to, first and foremost, the 8-year war between Iran and Iraq. But beyond that, the shifting of the security question from the regional to the security question on the nuclear issue and Iran's relationship with the West and the United States in particular. And that has interesting implications. I'm sure that Fatima, you will talk a little bit about those. So we're going to shift now to a presentation by Kivan, and I'm going to endeavor to make sure that I'm operating this system correctly, and will be absolutely amazed if I
load that up. Let me just say a couple things while that's happening. Thanks to USIP for inviting me. This project that Dan and Fadi started 3 years ago in the wake of 2009, in the wake of the Green Movement, asked a question that was very unpopular at the time, especially even among Iranian diaspora and opposition circles, was that what happened to politics in the Islamic Republic, both before 2009 and afterwards? Did things change irrevocably, or was there something else going on which might tell us something about Iranian politics in the future? As far as I know, this was the only group of scholars and analysts and activists who were willing to ask a difficult question like that and ask it honestly, as opposed to let blinders just decide the answer a priori. We asked that question. There was not a consensus, but the conversation that ensued 2 years before the 2013 election, mind you, arguably set a useful framework in which now we can read 2013. That without these kind of questions, 2013, the election outcomes that just happened in June are essentially still an enigma for the Iran expert community. So let me just make that point. I have written about economic policy in Iran. I've written a bit about the IRGC. Let me just make the point that, if the IRGC is such a monolithic actor, then why did they split their vote 3 ways? So, some segment of the IRGC outwardly supported Ghalibaf, Mel Ghalibaf. Another segment supported Jalili, and wasn't reported in the Western press, a segment of the IRGC supported Hassan Rouhani and voted for him. So if the IRGC is monolithic, then they clearly can't control their own rank and file, but actually a segment of the IRGC supported Rouhani. That doesn't mean that Rouhani is a man of the system, just like everybody else. Actually, it says the opposite, is that the IRGC is a divided institution because it's a big bureaucratic institution. And I've also taken similar positions on the IRGC about their role in the economy. I think that it's overstated, and if people Google me, my Princeton website has all my articles for download for free. So you can read that stuff. I'm not going to go into that now, but I would take some of these things with a grain of salt, especially the way it's portrayed. I was also a USIP junior peace scholar. They funded my dissertation writing, so I thank the USIP for that. All these things wouldn't happen without USIP. So they're an important institution, and they promote the good relationships between academic research and policy relevant writing. So, okay, so I was in Iran for the election. I guess you can do that. And a funny thing happened on the way to the Iranian election, which was what I'm about to show. So there were really 2 elections going on at the same time. There was an election for city council in all of Iran, which, city councils help determine municipal politics. In Tehran, they select the mayor, so it's quite important. And then there was a presidential election. They were scheduled to happen on the same day. So I spent a bit of time outside of Tehran to say, what does an election look like in Iran? What actually happens? Because we don't actually know what an election looks like generally. So this is a candidate running for city council in Tabriz, up in the north part of Iran, in the Azerbaijani area, and she is presenting herself as a technocrat. Okay, so I've translated a bit, but she was a former city council member. She's a PhD in urban planning. She could bring herself as Dr. Iran Ahor, and I'm actually not sure if she won or not, but this was actually very common, this sort of technocratic politics, presenting themselves as good managers. This is a famous square in Tabriz. Unfortunately, the picture is kind of too distant, but if you take a look in the back behind the monument, you will see presidential posters for multiple candidates all right next to each other. We have Rouhani, we have Jalili over there, there's some Velayati. Mayor Ghalibaf is not present, but the point is that the sort of mobilization of candidate excitement was happening all in public space, and we didn't know what was going to happen next, but it was happening even outside of Tehran. And this is interesting. This is right by the Bazaar in Tabriz. This guy, young guy, his name is Mir Mousavi. Now, Mousavi is a common name in Iran, so there's lots of Mousavis. They're not all reformists, they're not all Green Movement guys. It's a common name. But he not only his name is Mir Mousavi, but he puts a splash of green paint on his poster there, just to make sure that you realize that he allies himself with the Green Movement, or the memory of the Green Movement. So he's a Mousavi and he's a Green. And I was just surprised to see this in Tabriz, but there it is. There it is. So it's clear like he's trying to get the youth vote. This is a list, I mean, not everybody knows how, the city council, like in Tehran, thousands of people are running for 31 slots. How do you know who to vote for? Well, you don't always know who to vote for, so groups of political alliances and networks put out lists. And this is a list, basically a moderate conservative list, and with all the names you should vote for, you can tear this off and bring it into the polling booth and write down the names if you want. So, this is partly how it's organized, but I just want to make the point that these are conservatives, by they running for Tabriz City Council, and on the right of their names, it's all doctor this, engineer this, Ostad, professor this. So even the conservatives present themselves as good managers, good stewards of the state. This is how politics in Iran sounds from below. Okay, now to Tehran, a few days before the election, and everyone thought that Mayor Ghalibaf was going to win. The mayor had the mayoral machine under him. There's a lot of machine politics going on. He had quantity, and he had, you're not good at this, and he had quality. And he had quality. This is Revolution Square in Tehran, and we see Mayor Ghalibaf on the left, big public space, his face is all over the place. And we see Khomeini on the right, voting in an earlier Iranian election. So there's some association with, Khomeini voted, you should too, and vote for this guy. However, there was something else going on in Iran, and this was a grassroots movement from below. Rouhani was not an exciting candidate. He was made exciting. And he was made exciting because people were demanding a candidate to vote for which the Reformists backed. This process produced a huge wave of excitement, and it focused on whichever candidate former Presidents Khatami and Rafsanjani decided to basically put their hand on. And they picked Rouhani because they internally felt that Rouhani would resonate better, not just in Tehran, but outside of Tehran, and actually have a possibility of winning the election. So this is a cab, and there's Rouhani just slapped on. No one paid this guy to put all these posters on his cab. They're not easy to get off, by the way, so if he lost, it would have sucked. Note this, there's a poster on the bottom right there, and who's on that poster other than Rouhani? It's also Khatami and Hashemi Rafsanjani. So the linking of these two former presidents and the symbolic aspect of they represent change. They represent the possibility for change. Just the possibility for change is important. All of a sudden, they're with Rouhani. This created a groundswell of excitement to maybe I will vote this time. Okay? This is a city council, Tehran City Council poster. Just I'm going to make the point that Khanoumi Yaghouti here is saying vote. She's saying vote because we all thought that no one was going to vote this time, that participation was going to be low. People were predicting low participation, just a conservative kind of race between themselves, and the people who voted in 2009 were going to sit out this one. She was saying vote. It's with the exclamation point up there if you see it. But vote with thought and foreplanning, meaning like bring a list into the election booth and make sure you're voting strategically. Vote strategically. This is a little bit of comic relief. This is the famous airplane captain pilot Hussein Shahbazi, who landed the Iran airplane whose front landing gear didn't come out. If you see the plane in there, he actually landed the plane without front landing gear. He was a hero in the Iranian press. He saved hundreds of lives, and then decided to run for office with this sort of very ostentatious presentation of his role as a pilot. Okay? This is the Iranian media covering the election. This is what an average newspaper kiosk looks like in Tehran. And people stand over it and try to read the news for free. Now, Iran doesn't have a free media. I mean, there's controls on the media, but it has a competitive media. And you can learn a lot by understanding Iranian politics by looking at the media, because there's no official political parties in Iran. People often express political positions vis-a-vis their own personal newspapers or newspapers. So you have right-wing media here. You have liberal media. You have business press. You got the sports pages. It's a lot. And this isn't even all of it, by the way. And they're not all saying the same thing. This isn't Pravda times 20, right? This is actually a rather competitive media system that produces, because of its competition, produces the incentive to, let's just say, push the lines, right? That's what Iranian media does. Okay, here's voting day. This is the line that I was in. And this line took about 2.5 hours from start to finish. And this is the men's line. The women's line was on the other side of the mosque. And luckily, we had this young soccer star entertaining us for a while we were waiting, because it took a long time. It was beautiful weather for voting. Perfect. The Reformists got lucky. This is inside. What does it look like when you vote in Iran? It looks like this. This is, of course, a pretty famous mosque, but generally looks like this on the left. It's kind of chaos in there. There's some cameras. They're doing some interviews. There's some foreign dignitaries in there. There were some Arabs from Khuzestan up there voting for some reason. On the right, this is the ballot box. On the right are election workers sitting down, making sure that you get your card stamped and they make sure you're the right person. And there's 2 ballot boxes, 1 box for president, 1 box for city council. It just happened that the man whose hand right there is putting the ballot in the box is the hand of Ebrahim Yazdi, who was voting that day at this polling booth. Ebrahim Yazdi was the first foreign minister of the Islamic Republic of Iran, came back with Khomeini on the plane from Paris, and then was basically kicked out of the Islamic Republic's political system for 30 years, put in jail, disenfranchised. His party was essentially removed from participation. You know, the loser of the revolution, he voted. He voted, very important. And this was the party. The party the day after when Rouhani's election was announced. 2 hours after that, I walked out in the street, and this was going on everywhere in Tehran, and not just Tehran, right? Rouhani won because he won the provincial vote. You can't just win Tehran and win the election, right? You need to win all the other cities in Iran, and that's what he did. This is the party. Okay, so turn that off, and let me say a couple things about what the election means. This election was an accident. To look at the election ex post facto and say that this was the way that, retrospectively, and say this is the way it was going to work out, this is the way actually the system wanted, that either you weren't there or you weren't looking. Because this election was an accident. It could have gone a lot of other ways. And let me tell you why this magical outcome happened. And magical meaning it was rather rare. This election, depending on what happens in Iran in the next 5 to 10 years, could be the most important election in Iranian history after the 1979 revolution. It's at least as important right now, I think, as the 1997 election of Mohammad Khatami. What happened? How did this election produce such a surprise? Many elections in Iran do, but why this one? First thing is the implosion of the right wing. The implosion of the conservative elites, was immense, unexpected, and they brought it upon themselves. In fact, one of them said, we didn't get beat, we beat ourselves, we scored an own goal. Some football reference. Why did that happen? We misread Iranian politics after 2009. We thought that 2009 showed that the right wing in Iran had their act together and made a coherent, authoritarian network that basically then took over the state and were running things, and that was the way it was going to be in Iran ever since then. Instead, 2009 caused the further self-destruction of the right wing. The Green Movement presented such a huge challenge for governance in Iran that for about 6 months, they all looked like they were getting along. And then as soon as the Green Movement ended, as soon as they lost, essentially, the conservatives turned upon themselves and decided to eat their own. Okay, so they, through their own perception of success, started to divide many, many different ways, by the time it came to the 2013 election, there were 4 right-wing candidates, right-wing from right to right, and then 1 center or center-left candidate. Why did all 4 of them stay in? They all thought they were going to win. I mean, they were incredibly self-assertive. They thought that the conservatives had this locked in. So the hubris of the right wing is what produced the climate. But how did the reformists actually get people to vote for Rouhani? That was the second part of the election and the most astonishing part. When Hashemi Rafsanjani, former president of Iran, decided he was going to run for president, it created a wave of excitement among the population, who basically were, rather apathetic previously, and said, you know what? If he can be elected, things might actually change. He was then disqualified by the House of Lords in Iran, the Guardian Council, and then this wave of excitement turned into an even bigger wave of disillusionment. People had tasted change all of a sudden. And then they realized, no, the system is definitely not going to let this happen. But, and the reformists themselves, by the way, thought that, you know what, we're probably going to sit this out. Khatami reportedly was thinking about advocating non-participation. Then an amazing thing happened in Iran. They started to get messages, letters, calls, statements from grassroots activists, people who voted in 2009, not just in Tehran, but from elsewhere, from outside of the city. People calling, people talking, people demanding, support a candidate, and we will vote for him. We want to participate in this election because we know that there's an opening and we might be able to change things, because the Hashemi interlude previewed that. The reformists and representatives from the sort of the moderate elites in Iran decided to get their act together and be ruthlessly pragmatic in this election, more pragmatic than the liberals in Iran have ever been. They did polling, internal polling outside of Tehran to see between the two center-left candidates, which one resonated more outside of Tehran. Rouhani was winning these internal polls. They realized that if Khatami and Hashemi or Rafsanjani supported Rouhani, he would possibly be sent into the second round of elections. They themselves had no idea that he was going to win the first round. But it was this combination of grassroots pressure from below that pushed the Iranian reformists to get their act together, and then this ruthless pragmatism. They were so disenfranchised, so kicked out of the system, they had only one option, which was to make an alliance with each other and to put all the disagreements to the side and externally take one position, and everybody adheres to that. That supply and demand created the wave of participation, which surprised everybody, all the experts. Nobody saw it coming. Okay, 2013 would have been possible without 2009. The Green Movement, it was not, they didn't lose in the long run. They ended up actually having an effect, but this time through the ballot box, not through the street. What does this mean about U.S. policy coming forward? Well, the first thing we need to realize in the wake of the 2013 elections is the Islamic Republic is not going to collapse. It's not going anywhere. If the purpose of sanctions is to produce a revolution, instead it produced a relatively democratic election, right? They didn't have everybody they wanted to choose from, but it turned out to be a fair election in the end. So you're not going to get a collapse of the system, and it's not going anywhere. We just have to realize that. We're going to be dealing with the Islamic Republic now for at least 8 more years, if not 30, 40, 50 years. It's not going to collapse, and what is the environment in which Rouhani is operating in? This pragmatism is only possible if this alliance holds and they can keep, basically people inside the tent. So from here, we're going to be seeing Rouhani doing a lot of things that maybe for us looks weird. Shaking hands with the conservatives, going and talking with the hardliners, the right wing. But he's a politician. And in this case, I think we should remember, as we read the news coming out of Iran over the next 6, 7 months, as we see the negotiations happening in the United States, as we see the statements coming out of Iranian leaders, we should remember the old adage of LBJ, who said, I would prefer my enemies, pardon me here, I would prefer my enemies inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. So I would say that Rouhani, he's a smart guy, he's sort of a foreign policy wonk. I think he understands that, and that arguably will be the strategy of the new government in the time forward. What the U.S. decides to do about that is a separate question.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Kevin. A couple of things that you mentioned I think are worth accentuating. First of all, the hardliners, the principalists, whatever you wish to call them, had always confronted the reality of urbanization and the capacity of urban political elites to mobilize in the main cities, and so the strategy was, of course, to compensate for that by trying to mobilize in the rural areas. And to the extent that this did not work out that way, and the rural areas are mobilizing behind Rouhani, it's a very, very interesting dynamic that that's worth close attention. Your slide about the press is very important, and as I was watching it today and this morning, I kind of regretted we didn't include one study of the press as well, because the basic sort of consensus opinion was, well, in this new post-2009 despotic Iran, there's no reformist press and there's no discussion of anything worth tracing. Of course, we knew that wasn't true, and we were watching the press closely over the last couple of years, but the diversity of opinion, even in the context of an authoritarian system, is well worth accentuating as well. And finally, and a point then, this will allow us to turn the microphone over to you, Fatima. Your study written on the electoral system demonstrates, of course, that the leadership of the Reformists matters a great deal, what they choose to do with their ability to coalesce. And you had under the Reformists a leader, but the absence of a sustainable popular movement. In 2009, you have a popular movement by significant differences within the leadership of the Reformists, of course exacerbated by the regime itself. Nobody's blaming them for those differences. But the point I think worth accentuating here, the one that Kevan was mentioning, is the ruthless pragmatism, the capacity to coalesce. We don't know if it's sustainable or not. But also the implications of that, which means, of course, that ultimately part of the negotiation is about making sure that you've got the leader and the principalists, at least if not on your side, willing not to sabotage some sort of dynamic of political accommodation, as small as it may be in the beginning, and as fragile as that may be. So, and of course, that has interesting implications for U.S.-Iranian relations to the extent that Rouhani is simply not free to do as he wants. He has to keep a very sharp eye on not only the Reformists on the one hand, but of course the hardliners on the other. And as you said, with the metaphor shaking hands, we're going to probably see a lot of that. But ultimately, in terms of managing, and this is the challenge of any reformist, you've got two constituencies, and you've got to keep faith with both of them, or certainly not antagonize either one. And we'll be seeing how that evolves. And in that regard, Fatima, I'm going to give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Dan, for organizing this panel. As Dan explained, also I contributed a paper on the Green Movement, and for this talk today, one of my main questions is if the 2013 presidential election and election of Rouhani may pave the way for the sort of accommodation and political opening in Iran. And to what extent will the shift of power happen? We know that the post-2009 election unrest and brutal crackdown has created a stalemate, and the regime didn't accommodate the opposition movement by the time in 2009 and reverse the transition toward even pre-transition period. But this backlashed on 2013. The 2013 election may lead to more political opening and a sort of accommodation depending on several variables, which I would like to categorize in general to two main categories. One is domestic dynamic, and the second, foreign reception approach. Domestic dynamic among political actors and the people. Here we could see the role of youth movement, which embodied as a green movement during 2009, and they actually created the situation now. And Rouhani's, one of the reasons Rouhani was elected because of this youth movement. And very interestingly that even though if you remember the main basic quest for post-election unrest in 2009 was where is my vote? And now, after 2013 election, people shouted on the street that Musavi Karubi, we regain your vote in another vote. So we could say this election is sort of continuation of the 2009 election. To answer this political opening in the society, we should see role of the reformist centrist coalition that created the victory, and that was the second reason for Rouhani being elected, conservative forces, IRGC, and the parliament. One important issue is a leadership issue, which is in Green movement, we see sort of weak leadership for variety reasons, the level of oppression and then house arrest of the Green movement leaders, Mousavi and Karoubi. And also we know that many scholars and activists call them as accidental leaders or symbolic leaders. And that played important role. Now, for past few years, we see a clear leadership. I would like to call it sort of a triangle leadership. I call it triangle leadership by considering the result of the election. But what is this triangle leadership? Three angles of this leadership are President Khatami, President Hashemi Rafsanjani, and now President-elect Rouhani. Khatami has been taking more bold steps to lead the reform movement in recent years. And with his leadership, the reformists took a very pragmatic approach on the 2013 election by backing Rouhani. That is very important element. He actually led the coalition. Of course, the reformists and moderate elites have been working together to better use their very limited opportunity to leverage the election and its outcome. Also, we should take into consideration a positive role that Hashemi Rafsanjani has played for this unity. Both of them have been representing people's demands. If we look at two events, pre-event of 2013 election, clearly the sign from the establishment was they don't want return of reformists to politics. They rejected after period of the reform movement, and by any means they try to ban their president. At the beginning, they didn't let Khatami run for the election. And after that, once all of them organized around Hashemi Rafsanjani, you know that he was disqualified. And that was a moment for radicalization. But I think for many reasons, for many factors, this coalition and the youth movement, they decided not to be radicalized and to actually to grab limited opportunity they have. So they have to decide between Arif and Rouhani. The message from below was they want to participate in this election, even though Rouhani or Arif are not their great candidate, but they wanted to do something. Then by first public campaign, the vote shifted toward Rouhani. He appeared very well on that campaign. The third angle of this leadership is Rouhani itself. And the question is, what type of player will Rouhani be for opening of the society? People have a civil, we could identify people's demand in three important areas: civil liberties, and second, economic improvement, and a third, nuclear files, which is directly would impact the economy and having a better relation with in general. They wanted to end the isolation that Iran have been experiencing for past 8 years. Rouhani many times has stated that he will accommodate people's demands, but what tool does he have to address people's needs? Definitely, Rouhani is not going to endanger his power. And he has listened and has lesson learned from the past 16 years of Khatami's reform period and Ahmadinejad period. In another word, Rouhani sitting there on the Expediency Council, witnessing the situation and learning what to do. Now they have a better understanding of how they can play within the system, what is their limitation, what is their opportunity, how they grab the opportunity and extend that opportunity, and how play with the supreme leader, how to play with the Revolutionary Guard, the parliament, and so on, in order to meet those demands. This is very important, and I think Rouhani clearly has that ability to address that issue and to create a win-win situation. In general, I will consider the 2013 election as a win-win situation for all. I think the supreme leader won in this election. He lacked the legitimacy. He actually lost his legitimacy and the regime legitimacy by conducting a fraudulent election in 2009. And that backlash, he couldn't imagine such a unrest, post-election unrest. And so he had to actually address that issue. So he tried to engineer election by vetting the candidate he want, and then after that, I think he tried to be neutral and to let people choose whomever they want to choose. And even in one of his statements, he mentioned that to send a clear message that nobody has to interfere in the election. He clearly said, we have to sit and see how God would actually, how God will let people actually choose. So I have 2 minutes, I have to wrap up.
I'll give you 3.
Okay, thank you. So one of the main challenges for Rouhani is how will he balance between people's demands and the current establishment? I said he is not going to endanger his power to assure that he is out of stalemate and he's not going to create more problem. Who will carry out those demands? And these are important. From my perspective, definitely the society will open up. The question is the extension of this opening. And of course, we could see several scenarios for the extension of opening. If Rouhani can give a share of power to all of these political camps, from conservative to reformists, then he could create a win-win situation to address national problems. Nuclear file is a national problem. Normalization relation with the West, particularly with the United States, one of the important demand and one of the problem that Rouhani has to address, but he can't address unless he makes sure there is a consensus within the society, within the elite. And he has to create situation that everybody feels they win, they solve the problem. As everybody now, they feel they win the election. Nobody feel that they lost the election. And so Reorganization of reformist centrist camp also is an important issue, which is right now the reformists trying to reorganize. And one of the signs is if they, for instance, they can reopen the Musharakat Party, the largest reformist party. If not, of course, they would, another scenario is they would reorganize within a new political party, and now under motto of Rouhani that say moderation and wisdom, several of political parties, political camp will create under this umbrella. But the point is everybody likes now would like to give their own narrative of moderation. Radicals wants to exclude reformists and green movement as a defining of the moderation, and other people also, they want to give this sort of definition for moderation. So another point is demands from the society that usually some of these reformist leaderships, they try to say, we have to stick to minimal demand. It is important we achieve to demand, even though those are minimal demand, but not losing our hope for addressing those demand. And my last point is actually definitely radicals may sabotage, and Rouhani has to think and engineer in a way that can address that. And of course, this reorganization may impact 2015 parliamentary election. And now that presidential election is ended, everybody that means political parties would think how they want to vote for the parliamentary election, and we will see same story. The second issue that may address Rouhani's success is impact of foreign issue and sanction. The opening that has been as a result of 2013 presidential election, Rouhani's success depends delivering his campaign promises, which is managing Iran foreign relations, particularly with the United States, improving economy and political opening. On all of these issues, receptive approach by the United States could strengthen his hand vis-a-vis conservative faction element. And although we may say we won't know whether this work until the West will try that. In terms of the nuclear issue, back in 2003, we know that Rouhani has a positive profile, addressed that in a more constructive way, so there is a hope for that. Just United States has to support his success in Iran by stopping more sanction and by sanction relief and creating a new atmosphere for new round of nuclear negotiation. I will stop here.
Terrific. Thank you very much. To accentuate the point you were just making, and it was very much relevant to a number of the papers in the project, there is, in any situation of opposition, an outside-inside distinction within Iran, but also regionally, internationally. You have actors on the inside and actors on the outside. Certainly, the overall message from the reformists that is reflected also in your paper is that their perspective is that their own political future, while not totally dependent on a resolution or some serious sustained effort at resolving the U.S.-Iranian Cold War conflict, that their own political fate will certainly be positively affected by a real effort at overcoming this conflict. And to the extent that that does not happen, they feel that they are very much constrained in terms of their own political leverage. And I think that's very much a point worth accentuating. One can have all kinds of debates about how we are approaching the nuclear issue and so on, but in terms of the fate of Iran's reformists, there is a window of opportunity that has opened up. Windows of opportunity in the Middle East have a habit of shutting closing down very quickly. So it's worth pondering. And with that, I think we'll invite our colleagues in the audience to step up. We have microphones on either end of the room. You can address your questions, and I require, as the supreme leader of today's event, questions and not speeches, please. Address your questions to one or more members of the team before you. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Ali Scotton from Caspian Global Consulting. Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. Following Rouhani's victory, many members in Congress have been congratulating themselves for what they perceive to be the impact of sanctions in influencing Iranian domestic politics. And I'd like to know some of your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Let me take a stab at that.
Oh, you start.
Sure. Okay, so, yeah, I was in Iran when that, that narrative came out. We talk about win-win-win, because then they were like, well, we caused this relatively democratic election through sanctions. There's a problem with this logic, and it reminds me of the aphorism of the egg and the stone, okay? So, it's from Mao Zedong. Mao pointed out that if you apply heat to a stone, you get a hot stone. If you apply heat to an egg, you get a chicken, all right? So if sanctions are the heat, I really don't think that most of the people who want to turn up the heat really think that you have an egg. Iran was an egg. They were going to turn up the heat that was going to produce this relatively free election. I really don't think that was part of the strategy. In retrospect, they can claim all they want. If they would have understood the egg better, then maybe the sanctions policy would be a lot different. I think that arguably it could have gone so many other ways, and we would have been saying something very different right now about sanctions if a right-wing conservative candidate had won in the first or second round. So I think it misses out on the internal political dynamics, which has been the long-term problem with U.S.-Iran policy, is that we always look retrospectively to the past and predict forward what's happened in the past, as opposed to taking the dynamics that we're talking about, that we tried to look at in our project, taking those dynamics seriously, and meaning that you have to leave space open for these dynamics to play out in Iran. And sanctions do the opposite of that.
Farzan, do you want to step into this? You addressed the issue of sanctions in your
So
paper.
just to, I guess, echo part of what Kayvon said, I'm a historian, so I naturally look to the past to some extent. And in the sanctions literature, we don't really have cases of sanctions, and sanctions are very kind of diverse entities, but we don't have clear cases of them overthrowing regimes or causing democratization. So I think you have to treat that with some skepticism. That being said, did it influence a lot of voters? I mean, on voting day, talking to a lot of people in the country, it was definitely one of the factors that was very much on their mind. And so it may have influenced them to vote for a candidate who would be more likely to get sanctions lifted. But if you look at the kind of the more hardliners, sanctions don't really seem to calculate or affect their calculations as much. So it may have affected the calculation of some, but yeah, we have to treat this idea that sanctions can cause this outcome with a lot of skepticism, I think.
Sanction from a U.S. National interest. I think if we look at from the whole issue from that perspective, I think one of the important question is, do you like to have a democratic government inside Iran? Do you work better with a democratic government inside Iran, or do you work better with the version of an example of Ahmadinejad government inside Iran? Which one do you prefer? If you feel a democratic government would create cooperation, regional, global cooperation between Iran and the West, Iran in the region, so the U.S. national interests would say that they have to support a democratic movement inside the country. United States can't create a democratic movement they can't export a democratic government inside the country. Something has to come from within the country, a version of, a domestic version of from inside the country. So if that is a case, I believe this is a great, rare opportunity, not only for Iran and Iran's national interests, but also for the United States and even for Israel national interests, that to support, open up in the society inside the country. This is a chance. There is two different attitudes inside the country. One attitude among the leadership and the elite inside the country, one attitude is that they see fundamental adversary between the United States and the West. They see United States definitely want to overthrow the country. On the other hand, and there are so many signs. Iran's leaders count so many of these signs on the variety of his speeches. On the other hand, there is another attitude that no, we could have a peaceful relation among United States and Iran. We could have a cooperative, we have mutual interest in the region, and at the global level, we could work together, we could work as allies. If you want to support the second attitude, you have to support Rouhani's government, because Rouhani has several advantages in current time that none of these presidential candidate would have that opportunity. He has one leg on the establishment. He understands the government. He is trusted by the leader. On the other hand, because of that triangle I explained, he has a direct link with the people, with the democratic movement inside the country. So if the United States try to show goodwill by reducing sanction relief program, that will strengthen the hand of democratic forces inside the country. And that would lead up to another victory in 2015 parliamentary election, and that would open up society. Iranian in general, if you look at the demography, they are educated, they are pro-West in general, and they want democratic measure in the country. Sanction definitely reverse this situation. Sanction will give more opportunity. By sanction, United States feed radicals inside the country. This is your choice to choose to feed radical inside the country or to feed a democratic movement inside the country.
Thank you. My name is Layla Magari, and I have a question about civil society. After 2009, we saw severe clampdowns on a once vibrant civil society, relatively speaking, that continues until today. And I'm curious for the panelists, what do you think the election of Rouhani means for civil society going forward, and do you expect to see a shift?
They are so hopeful. Civil society was one of the reasons Rouhani is elected now. And so they are so hopeful, and Rouhani addressed that. He said he's going to definitely execute Chapter 3 of Iran's constitution, which is explained about civil liberty, freedom, and security, and so on.
You know, your question about civil society raises a related issue. One of the superb contributions to this project is by Shadi Mukhtari, a colleague of ours who writes on human rights. And she demonstrates in great detail the extent to which the discourse of human rights survived the effort to crush civil society and permeated not simply the opposition, but within the elite circles of the regime itself, to the extent that, and of course our colleague, Professor Carr, talks about this, to the extent that when somebody was arrested, the judges were always insisting that they were respecting the rule of law. Of course, this was cynical, but they felt they had to say it because the kind of discourse of human rights had been so successful in some sense. And the survivability of that legacy is very important. Everybody's on notice. This is the backlash, the boomerang effect of 2009. So you have a discourse of human rights, a rights discourse that is very much present, and to the extent that it can be institutionalized once again through the civil society arena, that would provide some modest basis for hope.
Hi, my name is Ada Sonnenfeld. I was just wondering, especially because you guys came from long discussions with U.S. government people, where you thought U.S. government policy was headed. Do you think they're open to looking at a change in tactics? Like, is Rouhani reformist enough for them? And related to what Mr. Sabet had been talking about, would different sanctions hurt the IRGC more, or is just sanctions in and of themselves not terribly productive? Thanks.
Well, I think it'll be incumbent upon me to dodge your question. But seriously, first of all, the kinds of conclusions that we draw in this report reflect the conclusions of those who've authored the report, and the USIP does not take any institutional position on any of these policy questions. Obviously, we're pro-peace, right? That's obvious. But your question raises an issue that has been at the heart of the debate about sanctions, and that is the perception of sanctions in Iran, certainly among the hardliners, but also the reformists, is that sanctions are not a tactic to draw the Iranians into negotiations, as a tactic, as a strategic part of a policy of regime change. And that, of course, has always been the position of the hardliners and the supreme leader. To the extent that sanctions are a way of twisting the arms of the Iranian leaders to get to the table, you can argue whether they have or have not been a success. Maybe so. But then the question is, what happens to sanctions? And what the ultimate goal of negotiations are, and what the final deal has been. And my personal opinion is that you can see within the debate in Washington about sanctions and about how to deal with Iran a shift towards a recognition that a policy of tactics without defining the ultimate goal of negotiations is necessary. That if we're going to go to the negotiating table and have a serious negotiation, there has to be some sort of agreement on where you want to go. And then you can haggle over how to get there. And it's in that context that we have to debate the role of sanctions, and whether ultimately sanctions will be removed as part of a set of incentives in what would be a genuine dual-track approach, in which there are both ways to twist the arm of your opponent, at the same time put real incentives on the table. And that's something we have to wrestle with, and I think you can see that debate taking place in the policy arena. And it's a positive debate. It's perhaps a little late in coming, because the focus on sanctions is merely as a tactic, without thinking about ultimately where you want to go with negotiations, has really not played to the favor, in my opinion, of the United States. It's hurt us in our negotiating position.
Let me make 2 points on this from the perspective of what sanctions look like on the Iranian side. And I don't want to pick on one aspect of the policy. I don't want to pick on the State Department. But for example, before the 2013 election, the United States executive branch passed through a license to allow the importation of particular types of IT equipment, like licenses for software, licenses for particular things. This was celebrated as a way to get social media into the hands of the Iranian population. It was celebrated, it was tweeted, of course it was tweeted. And at the same time, however, and of course, many people advocated for this a long time in Washington, D.C., and there was a victory for them. At the same time, I mean, about a week and a half later in Iran, because Parliament, America's Parliament, Congress thinks I've been in Iran for a while. Basically attached a rider to the Defense Authorization Act to add on extra sanctions. So Obama signed that. He had to actually implement it. A week and a half after this license was granted, additional sanctions were announced on the auto industry in Iran, which is a huge industry, employs peripherally about 700,000 people in Iran, on new transactions, on finance, on trade, et cetera, like that. Both happened at the same time. What do you think? Do you think the Iranians separate out these two? Said, well, they really meant well, but at the same time, no. If the left hand of the state is the nice hand, pets like that, and the right hand of the state is the hand that slaps, well, they're both attached to one body. And this was coming before the election. So how can this be perceived by an Iranian who's, wondering, why are they doing this to us? We're about to have an election. This is the only chance we have, and yet they're doing this. It does not look well from the perspective of on the ground in Iran for this. I mean, I understand that we have a divided government and that there's all kinds of things going on inside. That's fine. But to think that that can be translated into policy and coherently understood in Iran is hogwash. But put it technically.
So can I make a few points, or 2 points specifically? So I think the first part of the question was, is the U.S. considering a change of approach, or I guess alternative approaches? And I think the Obama administration, from what I've heard, is seriously considering improving the kind of carrot aspect of the carrot approach. If you're going to use sanctions as instruments, don't simply work by forcing your opponent to capitulate immediately. You have to negotiate with them. You have to actually offer the sanctions relief for your opponent to be willing to actually give concessions. That's how sanctions have historically worked. So but I think they are seriously considering that, but I think in terms of the U.S. component of the sanctions, President Obama is limited to the extent to which he can give sanctions relief. And so I think they're looking for more creative approaches of how they can do this. One thing that I'll be writing on in the next month or so is kind of doing it through the Europeans, where there is less of an impediment to giving sanctions relief. In terms of the second question, are there sanctions that could be more damaging to specific targeted entities versus the broad population? And in theory, and we've seen this work with some United Nations sanctions, Professor Thomas Bierstecker at the Graduate Institute where I am manages a research network, and they've done a lot of empirical research on this. Targeted sanctions, which are very narrow in the actors they kind of approach, have in the past shown to be similarly effective to more broad or more comprehensive sanctions. So I think there are different instruments that the U.S. could use in theory, but in practice thus far, it seems like they haven't really taken that approach. And the sanctions that have been construed narrowly in their application have turned out to be much broader.
Another question. I have the power. Ali Mehdi from the Middle East Broadcasting Network, and I have two questions. The first one for you, Mr. Kevin. And you just came from Iran, and we knew the Arab Spring started actually in Iran in 2009, and we call it the Persian Spring. And now we see everything going on in the Middle East. Do you think, did you see any positive, did you get any positive reactions from the Iranian inside Tehran about the Arab Spring? And do you think this is what we see in Tehran today is part of, more reform in all the region? The second question is for you, Mr. Dan. What is the future of the nuclear program in Tehran? And do you think we will see more winning to the left in Iran in 2017 election?
Yeah, my name is Buhendwa. I'm an international student from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I wanted to know on the issue of regional balance of power and Iranian position in the Middle East. What's your prediction of the future foreign policy stand that you think Iran might pursue? Should Iran maintain its position on developing nuclear programs, and the West still deteriorate or like strengthen the sanctions towards Iran. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for excellent presentations. I'm from the Polish embassy here, and I have short questions. First one is, was foreign policy a major issue in the campaign before the elections? I mean, not only nuclear policy, policy towards Syria, and so on, was a major issue. Second, you mentioned that the hardliners see sanctions as a vehicle for regime change in Iran. What is the public, I mean, in the public, Iranian society thinks about this? Is there any kind of public awareness that to open up the country, to lift up the sanctions, we have to do something with the nuclear issue? How much support the current nuclear policy has in the Iranian politics? And the last question is, do you think we'll be following from the first and second? Do you think that the new president will feel any public pressure for him after he takes the power in August to change the nuclear approach, not only from the establishment, but also there will be public pressure for him to do so? Thank you.
You want to start from our colleague from the Polish embassy back to the other questions, perhaps? Any way you feel like. I'll take a stab at it.
Well, I had a question directly about the Arab Spring and then a question about sanctions. So let's deal with the Arab Spring issue. So what do Iranians think about it? Well, look, there's been a global wave of protests since arguably 2008. So I don't think Iran started anything. You know, Iranians like to be in the middle of every kind of story, but they're not. And I'm sure Iranians get upset every time I say that. There's been a global wave of protests in 2008, which is still playing out as happened over the summer. It was amazing being in Iran, and Iran was the feel-good story of the summer, and nearby in Turkey, it was the basically end of the Turkish model as a model to be replicated beyond that. I think that the reality has set in the wake of the Arab Spring, sometimes quite tragic, sometimes not. And it's too soon to tell how the region's going to rebalance itself with either new forces in power or the old guys coming back to power. And the same thing's in Iran. So the regional question is also an outcome of these new demands from below, and you can't write off, political scientists and social scientists, we're both social scientists, had discounted discounted society in the Middle East for 30 years, as did the rulers themselves, by the way. That's now over. That's over. So it's a new day, and we'll see what happens. Iranians were fascinated with the Turkish protests. It really changed their mind about how to read Turkey. By the way, the press was very interested in covering Turkey. Ditto the revolution just happened in Egypt. They're not all on the same page about the Muslim Brotherhood, about the army in Cairo. It's very interesting to see how the Iranians view this. On sanctions, here's the problem. Targeted sanctions, what do you target? If you look at an org chart of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, supposedly, and all of their supposed tentacles in the economy, and then you say, I'm going to attack that. That's what they do, basically, at the Treasury Department here. I'm going to attack that, I'm going to attack that, I'm going to attack that. You get sanctions creep. And that's what's been going on in the last 2 or 3 years. Let's add one more to the list, one more company, one more front company, one more industry, the auto industry. And the reason they put sanctions on the auto industry is because they think that it's in the hands of the Revolutionary Guard. It's not. It's a huge industry with all kinds of stakeholders. So with sanctions creep, which unfortunately, the reason that these things have happened is because we've told them that the IRGC is the only game in town, which is just not true. It's a complex society. I tried to write about that to say this is not the case. But from a policy perspective, it's just much more easy. It's just easier to say that, well, it's all in the hands of one bad guy. So if we target the whole economy, we're really only targeting the bad guys. But that's not seen that way in Iran, nor is it the reality. It's experienced quite differently. And this sanctions creep, my worry is that it's so difficult. It's easy to add another sanctions because the apparatus is in place. We have an apparatus of sanctions. We've got 10,000 bureaucrats every day pouring over the news saying who we're going to add to a list, what company to add to a list. To reverse that process might be incredibly difficult. To reverse that process in line, in time with U.S. foreign policy, let's say something happens. All of a sudden there's a rapprochement. Well, can we roll back sanctions that easily? I'm skeptical about that. That's my biggest worry.
Thank you. In terms of nuclear support from the public, I think President-elect Rouhani has a profile of addressing nuclear file in a pragmatic, positive, constructive way. And that was something that people could compare his approach and reformist approach versus Jalili's approach. There was no sanction by 2005, and sanction has started once Ahmadinejad got the government and new people appointed as a nuclear chief. And so people, little by little, they realized that foreign policies, particularly on nuclear issue, has impacted their everyday life. So the one reason that Rouhani elected was because of this. Already people showed their demand. I would consider this election as a sort of referendum on nuclear issue. This doesn't mean that the regime would change their approach to the nuclear issue. Already clearly Rouhani announced his policy on nuclear issue. He said we can't back to sustaining nuclear enrichment. It should be negotiation. The point is they want domestic nuclear enrichment, but on the detail of that domestic enrichment, there is a huge room for negotiation. What should be that? 5%, 6%, 10%, because we know that right now Iran enrich nuclear up to 20%. That is certainly something that they can discuss through negotiation. On the other hand, the world worry about diversion to militarization aspect of nuclear program. By sure, Rouhani can address that concern as well, again, in a constructive way. So I can say a new deal from both sides should be based on right and obligation. Iran's right and Iran's obligation to make the work to make sure nothing is going to happen. There is no military approach. I think people want this, and President Rouhani wants that, and they will act based on that. But as I said again, I am repeating myself, goodwill from the United States can strengthen Rouhani's approach toward the nuclear issue. Otherwise, little by little, radicals that Jalili represented them in the society in this election, little by little, they will regain their power and they may sabotage even nuclear talk. So this is why we say that United States has to grab this opportunity. We had so many missed opportunities in past during President Khatami period, and I think now both sides should understand this moment and should work constructively.
Let me just add a quick word on that, and then quickly respond to your Arab Spring question. I mean, I think everybody sitting here knows the role that Rouhani played as representing Iran in the negotiations on the nuclear file. So here we have this extraordinary sort of event whereby you get Rouhani elected, and he also happens to know this issue very well, and it was hotly debated during the and every attack on him he turned back. And while we often perceive in the United States that we've been out-negotiated on the nuke issue by Iran, the critics of this government in Iran were saying, you were out-negotiated, and look where you have taken us in this negotiation. And this critique, by the way, just didn't start the other day. It goes back already on several years. It intensified because it became an issue in the public, in the television debate as well, and Rouhani responded to it. So talk about sort of the effect of internal politics and national politics in terms of defining Iran's position on this question, and it will come down in part to the extent to which there can be an agreement by which some version of enrichment can be accepted or not. That's my personal sense of that particular question, and whether in both arenas of national politics in the United States and in Iran, we can address that issue. So we shall see. Ultimately, you have to have the stick and the carrot. Now, the Iranians don't like to hear anything about sticks, that's for sure. But in terms of a foreign policy coming from the United States, you can't talk about one without the other. But unfortunately, from my perspective, the other being the carrot has been a position that we've hesitated to, in fact, play because we don't know ultimately what we want out of the negotiation. And each side decides what it wants out of the negotiation and is comfortably domestically with that. And that's the other point I want to make. I don't want to put a quash on all this incipient optimism we're hearing here, but look, the Iranian Islamic Republic is in some respects a profoundly ideological republic. And it was built in part, there's no symmetry in that sense. It was built in part on, this is my interpretation, on hostility to U.S. power. And it's not an easy prop simply to pull out from the Islamic Republic. There are a lot of vested interests in defending that ideological prop, that partial foundation of the Islamic Republic. So when we're talking about negotiating the nuclear issue, it becomes to some extent, for some players, an existential matter. And that greatly complicates. And I don't think we should in any way underestimate how difficult that issue is. This may be an opportunity, it may be an opening, but let's not forget the extent to which, for Iranians, when I was in Iran the first time, I went on television and this fellow asked me, what do Americans think of Khomeini? And I thought, that's a fascinating question, as if he thinks we wake up every morning and worry about Khomeini, whereas he wakes up every morning and worries about us. He probably does. These are national histories in a conflict and have had repercussions, so it's not easy. But until we decide for ourselves where we want to go with the negotiations, it's going to be very hard to confront this challenge. And on the Arab Spring issue, look, and Kevin, I think you were alluding to this. One of the lessons that some perhaps in Iran took from what's going on with the ruling party in Turkey, and we can see it in Egypt too, is that when a party wins an election by hook or by crook and thinks it can then impose its cultural, ideological, and religious agenda on everybody else by force or by using the instruments of democracy, in quotes, you're going to provoke a response from that society that says no. And we can see that in the Taksim revolt. We can see that in the revolt of secular and non-Islamist forces in Egypt against what was seen as a coercive policy of the Muslim Brethren. And we can see this in a society such as Iran, which saw the instrument of elections and the so-called representation as a mechanism of imposing the culturally religious agenda of one particular sector of society on everybody else. And the big lesson here is the issue of power sharing, the issue of finding some basis of accommodation, the no victor, no vanquished thesis that Tom Friedman has been putting in his columns recently. I think it sums it up very well. How can we reach a common arrangement whereby we're not going to say that the result of a political change in Iran will be the exclusion of this or that force, but the inclusion of others. And how you get to that point is very tricky. It may or may not be possible. Fatima's point, as I understand it, and the point of many others who have contributed to this project, is that the course of the evolution of U.S.-Iranian relations affects those dynamics, and thus far has affected them in very negative ways. Whether we can get out of that is another matter. I'm not here to speculate on that. Let's take two more questions, and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
Sorry, can I quickly just respond?
Yes, please.
Thanks. So just to answer the question, some of the questions, I'll try to answer very narrowly what hasn't already been said. So to answer the questions from the gentleman from the Polish embassy, was foreign policy a major issue? Well, yes, specifically in regards to the nuclear issue and also via the economy because of the issue of sanctions. And also in terms of, will the new president give in to kind of public pressure to give concessions on the nuclear program? Well, the president has a very big seat at the table where major foreign policy, national security decisions are made and decisions over the nuclear program, but he doesn't have any kind of absolute power. And so, but he will probably have the latitude to give some concessions, but we'll have to wait and see. To answer the question from the gentleman, I believe from the Democratic Republic of Congo, in terms of regional balance of power, I mean, I think a Rouhani presidency would try to pursue a foreign policy in the region which engages the international community and various regional actors to a much greater extent. And so if the Rouhani does succeed and he can gain some momentum, I think you would see something which would be much more cooperative versus combative, whereas the IRGC and the more hardline factions within Iran, I mean, they're deeply suspicious of both the regional and international power, especially the United States, deeply suspicious of international organizations. Their viewpoint was to some extent shaped during the Iran-Iraq War, when Iran was economically and militarily nearly completely isolated. They had to fight in the trenches by themselves with little support, and so they kind of have this self-reliance and also very kind of aggressive mindset within the context of the region. So if Rouhani's foreign policy project is defeated, I think whatever would come after would have the potential to be, again, a much more aggressive regional foreign policy. Yeah.
We'll take one more question, and then I think we're going to have to wrap it up. Thank you.
You said before that even if the United States decided to pull back on the sanctions, it would be very, very difficult to do so. There must be some mechanism in place now. I mean, why would this be so hard to do?
Sorry.
Yes. Did you want to answer that?
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess I'll make very brief comments. Part of it is that the sanctions regime is very complex. And for example, President Obama wouldn't have complete authority to kind of pull back the sanctions himself. He would have to do it with congressional cooperation. And I think Iran is probably the only issue where there is complete bipartisan consensus in terms of the sanctions-making regime. The other thing is that the sanctions don't clearly say if the nuclear program, for example, is frozen for this period, or if it's completely stopped, or the sanction will be lifted. They're actually much more complex. Their requirements include human rights, democratization, stopping supports for militant groups like Hezbollah and others. So it's actually, when you kind of get into the nitty-gritty of it, it's a very complex regime. And I think in the case of Iraq, we saw it took years, even after the U.S. invaded and occupied Iraq, to actually lift all the sanctions. So even where there's a will to do so, it's not such a straightforward process because of the complexity of the sanctions regime.
Okay, we have one more gentleman. We'll be generous and take one more question, but then I think we're going to have to wrap it up and move on. This has been a tremendous.
Thank you for your.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for your presentations, and my question was already partially answered by Mr. Sabet. But again, with regard to the regional foreign policy of Iran, was it part of, was it discussed in the framework of elections? And will the victory of Rouhani will make Iran's policy in the region less aggressive and more pragmatic? For last several years, Iran was quite ambitious in its plans for the region, in its relations with Afghanistan, at least future plans for Afghanistan and Central Asia. So I'm specifically interested in Iran's new course in regional policy and in its relations with Afghanistan and Central Asian countries, particularly with Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. Thank you.
I mean, first thing to recognize is that Hassan Rouhani was the head of a foreign policy think tank in Iran at the same time that he was doing all these other things. The guy is a foreign policy wonk. He's an intellectual, right? So he knows the issues quite well, including the bilateral issues with Central Asia, the Caspian. There's lots of stuff going on that we don't cover over here, but they know quite well. Look, here's what the election revealed, that foreign policy, both on the nuclear issue and on regional issues, held by the Islamic Republic were not monolithic, even when we thought here that it was. The debates on public television, which about 2/3 of the country watched, right? We're talking about 50 million people watched the debates, okay? They revealed, accidentally probably, but they revealed that for all these past 8 years, there's been massive disagreements within the so-called, monolithic hardline security state. They've disagreed on everything. We didn't know that, or at least we pretended not to know that, and we said, no, they're all behind a single thing, and it's anti-us, anti-US, anti-us. In fact, they were all debating internally, and they disagreed about the nuclear file, about their relationship with other states in the region, and with Europe, and with Russia, China. And that spilled out onto the nation's tablecloths. They're not tablecloths, they're on sofa, floor cloths. In the third debate, and it was so embarrassing for the leader. I mean, if the leader really had everything wrapped up under his cloak, that never would have happened. Instead, it was just massively embarrassing for the so-called monolithic security state. It showed that there's been streams of dissent within the elite themselves this entire past, and now one of those streams is in power. What will happen next is how then they play the game, and how these elite alliances in Iran do not stay the same forever, right? They constantly shift and are remade. So if Rouhani can split essentially the right wing, we can split the right wing up. They've already split themselves up, so it's not going to be that hard. If he splits the right wing, brings some of them in, we might perceive that from here as a bad thing. Oh, he's bringing in all these right wingers. Actually, it would be the best thing. He would bring them in, give them a stake in the outcome. They could change a lot. They could change a lot, but they're not going to change their own self-perceived national interests. They're not going to capitulate in a way, they're not going to hand over the keys. And that would be a myth for us to think that, okay, well, this guy wins and everything's going to change. No, they're nationalists, right? And most of the bilateral relationships, for example, with Central Asia, with the Gulf states, those are from a longer-term perceived national interest, however you want to define it, but they've been defining it constantly since the revolution. And it actually is very similar to the nationalists of Iran as defined before the revolution. There's a lot of continuity there.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a tremendous discussion. I want to note my colleague Maral Nouri in the back, who has been instrumental in helping to pull off both this morning's meeting and this afternoon's meeting. USIP has a big building but a small staff, believe it or not. And those of us who have been working on the Middle East, we have been focusing for the last 2 weeks on Egypt and very much absorbed with that, as well as Tunisia, Libya, and other places. And we had to shift our focus back to this meeting. We had a lot to organize in a very small amount of time, and Maral and others here at USIP helped to make this possible. So I want to recognize their help in that regard, and we will let you know when the final report comes out, assuming that we can get a respite from the changes in the region to write it up. Thank you very much.